Chapter 13 of Headlong Hall. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. Chapter 13. The Ball. The ballroom was adorned with great taste and elegance, under the direction of Miss Cabrioletta and her friend Miss Cephalus, who were themselves its most beautiful ornaments, even though romantic Merion, the preeminent in loveliness, sent many of its loveliest daughters to grace the festive scene. Numberless were the solicitations of the dazzled swains of Cambria for the honour of the first two dances with the one or the other of these fascinating friends, but little availed on this occasion the pedigree lineally traced from Caractacus or King Arthur. Their two philosophical lovers, neither of whom could have given the least account of his great-great-grandfather, had engaged them many days before. Mr. Panscope chafed and fretted, like Lugoi in his bed of rocks, when the object of his adoration stood up with his rival, but he consoled himself with a lively damsel from the Vale of Adarnian, having first compelled Miss Cephalus to promise him her hand for the fourth set. The ball was accordingly opened by Miss Cabrioletta and Mr. Foster, who gave rise to much speculation among the Welsh gentry as to who this Mr. Foster could be, some of the more learned among them secretly resolving to investigate most profoundly the antiquity of the name of Foster, and ascertain what right a person so denominated could have to open the most illustrious of all possible balls with the lovely Cabrioletta Headlong, the only sister of Harry Headlong, Esquire of Headlong Hall, in the Vale of Llanberis, the only surviving male representative of the Andaluvian family of Headlong ap Raeda. When the first two dances were ended, Mr. Escott, who did not choose to dance with any one but his adorable Cephalus, looking round for a convenient seat, discovered Mr. Jenkinson in a corner by the side of the Reverend Dr. Gaster, who was keeping excellent time with his nose to the lively melody of the harp and fiddle. Mr. Escott seated himself by the side of Mr. Jenkinson, and inquired if he took no part in the amusement of the night. Mr. Jenkinson:
No, the universal cheerfulness of the company induces me to rise. The trouble of such violent exercise induces me to sit still. Did I see a young lady in want of a partner, gallantry would incite me to offer myself as her devoted knight for half an hour. But as I perceive there are enough without me, that motive is null. I have been weighing these points pro and con, and remain in statu quo.
Mr. Escott:
I have danced, contrary to my system, as I have done many other things since I have been here, from a motive that you will easily guess.
Mr. Jenkinson smiled.
I have great objections to dancing. The wild and original man is a calm and contemplative animal. The strings of natural appetite alone rouse him to action. He satisfies his hunger with roots and fruits, unvitiated by the malignant adhibition of fire and all its diabolical processes of elixion and assation. He slakes his thirst in the mountain stream, summiscetai te hypothecuse, and returns to his peaceful state of meditative repose.
Mr. Jenkinson:
Like the metaphysical statue of Condillac.
Mr. Escott:
With all its senses and purely natural faculties developed, certainly. Imagine this tranquil and passionless being occupied in his first meditation on the simple question of where am I, whence do I come, and what is the end of my existence? Then suddenly placed before him a chandelier, a fiddler, and a magnificent beau in silk stockings and pumps, bounding, skipping, swinging, capering, and throwing himself into 10,000 attitudes, till his face glows with fever and distills with perspiration. The first impulse excited in his mind by such an apparition will be that of violent fear, which, by the reiterated perception of its harmlessness, will subside into simple astonishment. Then let any genius sufficiently powerful to impress on his mind all the terms of the communication impart to him that after a long process of ages, when his race shall have attained what some people think proper to denominate a very advanced stage of perfectibility, the most favoured and distinguished of the community shall meet by hundreds to grin and labour and gesticulate like the phantasma before him, from sunset to sunrise, while all nature is at rest, and that they shall consider this a happy and pleasurable mode of existence, and furnishing the most delightful of all possible contrasts what they will call his vegetative state, would he not groan from his inmost soul for the lamentable condition of his posterity?
Mr. Jenkinson.
I know not what your wild and original man might think of the matter in the abstract, but comparatively I conceive he would be better pleased with the vision of such a scene as this, than with that of a party of Indians, who would have all the advantage of being nearly as wild as himself, dancing their infernal war dance round a midnight fire in a North American forest.
Mr. Escott.
Not if you should impart to him the true nature of both, by laying open to his view the springs of action in both parties.
Mr. Jenkinson.
To do this with effect, you must make him a profound metaphysician, and thus transfer him at once from his wild and original state to a very advanced stage of intellectual progression. Whether that progression be towards good or evil, I leave you and our friend Foster to settle between you.
Mr. Escott.
I wish to make no change in his habits and feelings, but to give him, hypothetically, so much mental illumination as will enable him to take a clear view of two distinct stages of the deterioration of his posterity, that he may be enabled to compare them with each other, and with his own more happy condition. The Indian dancing round the midnight fire is very far deteriorated, but the magnificent beau dancing to the light of chandeliers is infinitely more so. The Indian is a hunter, he makes great use of fire, and subsists almost entirely on animal food. The malevolent passions that spring from these pernicious habits involve him in perpetual war. He is therefore necessitated, for his own preservation, to keep all the energies of his nature in constant activity. To this end his midnight war dance is very powerfully subservient, and, though in itself a frightful spectacle, is at least justifiable on the iron plea of necessity.
Mr. Jenkinson.
On the same iron plea, the modern system of dancing is more justifiable. The Indian dances to prepare himself for killing his enemy, but while the bows and bells of our assemblies dance, they are in the very act of killing theirs. Time, a more inveterate and formidable foe than any the Indian has to contend with. For however completely and ingeniously killed, he is sure to rise again with 20 mortal murders on his crown, leading his army of blue devils, with ennui in the van and vapours in the rear.
Mr. Escott.
Your observation militates on my side of the question, and it is a strong argument in favour of the Indian that he has no such enemy to kill.
Mr. Jenkinson.
There is certainly a great deal to be said against dancing. There is also a great deal to be said in its favour. The first side of the question I leave, for the present, to you. On the latter, I may venture to allege that no amusement seems more natural and more congenial to youth than this. It has the advantage of bringing young persons of both sexes together in a manner which its publicity renders perfectly unexceptionable, enabling them to see and know each other better than, perhaps, any other mode of general association. Tête-à-têtes are dangerous things. Small family parties are too much under mutual observation. A ballroom appears to me almost the only scene uniting that degree of rational and innocent liberty of intercourse which it is desirable to promote as much as possible between young persons, with that scrupulous attention to the delicacy and propriety of female conduct, which I consider the fundamental basis of all our most valuable social relations.
Mr. Escott.
There would be some plausibility in your argument if it were not the very essence of this species of intercourse to exhibit them to each other under false colours. Here all is show and varnish and hypocrisy and coquetry. They dress up their moral character for the evening at the same toilet where they manufacture their shapes and faces. Ill-temper lies buried under a studied accumulation of smiles. Envy, hatred, and malice retreat from the countenance to entrench themselves more deeply in the heart. Treachery lurks under the flowers of courtesy. Ignorance and folly take refuge in that unmeaning gabble which it would be profanation to call language, and which even those whom long experience in the dreary intercourse of daily life has screwed up to such a pitch of stoical endurance that they can listen to it by the hour, have branded with the ignominious appellation of small talk. Small indeed! The absolute minimum of the infinitely little.
Mr. Jenkinson.
Go on. I have said all I intended to say on the favourable side. I shall have great pleasure in hearing you balance the argument.
Mr. Escott.
I expect you to confess that I shall have more than balanced it. A ballroom is an epitome of all that is most worthless and unamiable in the great sphere of human life. Every petty and malignant passion is called into play. Coquetry is perpetually on the alert to captivate, caprice to mortify, and vanity to take offence. One amiable female is rendered miserable for the evening by seeing another, whom she intended to outshine, in a more attractive dress than her own, while the other omits no method of giving stings to her triumph, which she enjoys with all the secret arrogance of an oriental sultana. Another is compelled to dance with a monster she abhors. A third has set her heart on dancing with a particular partner, perhaps for the amiable motive of annoying one of her dear friends. Not only does he not ask her, but she sees him dancing with that identical dear friend, whom from that moment she hates more cordially than ever. Perhaps what is worse than all, she has set her heart on refusing some impertinent fop who does not give her the opportunity. As to the men, the case is very nearly the same with them. To be sure, they have the privilege of making the first advances, and are therefore less liable to have an odious partner forced upon them, though this sometimes happens, as I know by woeful experience. But it is seldom they can procure the very partner they prefer, and when they do, the absurd necessity of changing every 2 dances forces them away, and leaves them only the miserable alternative of taking up with something disagreeable, perhaps, in itself, and at all events rendered so by contrast, or of retreating into some solitary corner to vent their spleen on the first idle coxcomb they can find.
Mr. Jenkinson.
I hope that is not the motive which brings you to me.
Mr. Escott.
Clearly not. But the most afflicting consideration of all is, that these malignant and miserable feelings are masked under that uniform disguise of pretended benevolence, that fine and delicate irony called politeness, which gives so much ease and pliability to the mutual intercourse of civilized man, and enables him to assume the appearance of every virtue without the reality of one.
The second set of dances was now terminated, and Mr. Escott flew off to reclaim the hand of the beautiful Cephalus, whom he figured away with surprising alacrity, and probably felt as happy among the chandeliers and silk stockings, at which he had just been railing, as he would have been in an American forest, making one in an Indian ring, by the light of a blazing fire, even though his hand had been locked in that of the most beautiful squaw that ever listened to the roar of Niagara. Squire Headlong was now beset by his maiden aunt, Miss Brindle New Grimalkin Phoebe Tabitha ap Headlong, on one side, and Sir Patrick O'Prism on the other, the former insisting that he should immediately procure her a partner, the latter earnestly requesting the same interference in behalf of Miss Philomela Poppyseed. The squire thought to emancipate himself from his 2 petitioners by making them dance with each other, but Sir Patrick vehemently pleading a prior engagement, the squire threw his eyes round till they alighted on Mr. Jenkinson and the Reverend Dr. Gaster, both of whom, after waking the latter, he pressed into service. The doctor arising with a strange kind of guttural sound, which was half yawn and half a groan, was handed by the officious squire to Miss Philomela, who received him with sullen dignity. She had not yet forgotten his falling asleep during the first chapter of her novel, while she was condescending to detail to him the outlines of 4 superlative volumes. The doctor, on his part, had most completely forgotten it, and though he thought there was something in her physiognomy rather more forbidding than usual, he gave himself no concern about the cause, and had not the least suspicion that it was at all connected with himself. Miss Brindlemew was very well contented with Mr. Jenkinson, and gave him 2 or 3 ogles, accompanied by a most risible distortion of the countenance, which she intended for a captivating smile. As to Mr. Jenkinson, it was all one to him with whom he danced, or whether he danced or not. He was therefore just as well pleased as if he had been left alone in his corner, which is probably more than could have been said of any other human being under similar circumstances. At the end of the 3rd set, supper was announced, and the party pairing off like turtles, adjourned to the supper room. The squire was now the happiest of mortal men, and the little butler the most laborious. The centre of the largest table was decorated with a model of Snowdon, surmounted with an enormous artificial leek, the leaves of Angelica, and the bulb of blancmange. A little way from the summit was a tarn, or mountain pool, supplied through concealed tubes with an inexhaustible flow of milk punch, which, dashing in cascades down the miniature rocks, fell into the more capacious lake below, washing the mimic foundations of Headlong Hall. The Reverend Doctor handed Miss Philomela to the chair most conveniently situated for enjoying this interesting scene, protesting he had never before been sufficiently impressed with the magnificence of that mountain, which he now perceived to be well worthy of all the fame it had obtained. Now, when they had eaten and were satisfied, Squire Headlong called on Mr. Chromatic for a song, whom, with the assistance of his 2 accomplished daughters, regaled the ears of the company with the following: Terzetto.
Grey twilight from her shadowy hill discolors nature's vernal bloom, and sheds on grove and field and rill,
and sheds on grave and field and rill
one blessed tint of deepening gloom,
one blessed tint of deepening gloom,
one blessed tint of deepening gloom. The sailor sighs
the sailor sighs mid shoreless seas, touched by the thought of friends afar,
as fanned
by ocean's flowing breeze,
as fanned by ocean's flowing breeze.
flowing.
He gazes on
The western star, the
wanderer hears in pensive dream the accents of the last farewell, pausing by the mountain stream.
as pausing by the stream,
He listens to the evening bell.
he listens to the evening bell,
As pausing by the mountain stream.
as pausing by the mountain stream. He listens to the evening bell.
The wanderer hears it in pensive dream, as pausing by the mountain stream, the mountain stream. He listens to the evening. He listens to the evening bell.
The evening bell.
This terzetto was of course much applauded, Mr. Milestone observing that he thought the figure in the last verse would have been more picturesque if it had been represented with its arms folded and its back against a tree, or leaning on its staff, with a cockle shell in its hat, like a pilgrim of ancient times. Mr. Chromatic professed himself astonished that a gentleman of genuine modern taste like Mr. Milestone should consider the words of a song of any consequence whatever, seeing that they were at the best only a species of pegs for the more convenient suspension of crotchets and quavers. This remark drew on him a very severe reprimand from Mr. McLaurel, who said to him,
"Dinna ye ken, sir, that sound is a thing utterly worthless in itself, and only effectual in agreeable excitements, as far as it is an echo to sense? Is there any sound more miserable and pitiful than the scrape of a fiddle when it does not touch any chord of the human sensorium? Is there any more divine than the deep note of the bagpipe when it breathes the ancient melodies of liberty and love? It is true, there are peculiar trains of feeling or sentiment which particular combinations of melody are calculated to excite, and so far music can produce its effect without words, but it does not follow that when you put words to it, becomes a matter of indifference what they are. For a good strain of impassioned poetry will greatly increase the effect, and the tissue of nonsensical doggerel will destroy it altogether. No, as good poetry can produce its effect without music, so will good music without poetry. And as good music will be more powerful by itself than with bad poetry, so will good poetry than with bad music. But when you put good music and good poetry together, you produce the divinest compound of sentimental harmony that can possibly find its way through the lug to the soul."
Mr. Chromatic admitted that there was much justice in these observations, but still maintained the subserviency of poetry to music. Mr. McLaurel as strenuously maintained the contrary, and a furious war of words was proceeding to perilous lengths when the squire interposed his authority towards the reproduction of peace, which was forthwith concluded, and all animosities drowned in a libation of milk punch, the Reverend Dr. Gaster officiating as high priest on the occasion. Mr. Chromatic now requested Miss Cabrioletta to favour the company with an air. The young lady immediately complied, and sung the following simple ballad:
O Mary, my sister, thy sorrow give o'er. I soon shall return, girl, and leave thee no more. But with children so fair and a husband so kind, I shall feel less regret when I leave thee behind. I have made thee a bench for the door of thy cot, and more would I give thee, but more I have not. Sit and think of me there in the warm summer day, and give me 3 kisses my labour to pay. She gave him 3 kisses, and forth did he fare, and long did he wander, and no one knew where. And long from her cottage, through sunshine and rain, she watched his return, but he came not again. Her children grew up, and her husband grew grey. She sat on the bench through the long summer day. One evening, when twilight was deep on the shore, there came an old soldier and stood by the door. In English he spoke, and none knew what he said, but her oat cake and milk on the table she spread. Then he sat to his supper, and blithely he sung, and she knew the dear sounds of her own native tongue. Oh, rich are the feasts in the Englishman's hall, and the wine sparkles bright in the goblets of gall. But their mingled attractions I well could withstand, for the milk and the oat cake of Miriam's dear land. "And art thou a Welchman, old soldier?" she cried. "Many years have I wandered," the stranger replied. 'Twixt Danube and Thames many rivers there be, but the bright waves of Sinfell are fairest to me. I felled the grey oak ere I hastened to Rome, and I fashioned a bench for the door of my home. And well my dear sister my labour repaid, who gave me 3 kisses when first it was made. In the old English soldier thy brother appears, here is gold in abundance, the saving of years. Give me oat cake and milk in return for my store, and a seat by thy side on the bench at the door.
Various other songs succeeded, which, as we are not composing a songbook, we shall lay aside for the present. An old squire, whom had not missed one of these anniversaries during more than half a century, now stood up, and filling a half-pint bumper, pronounced in a stentorian voice,
"To the immortal memory of Headlong ap Raider, and to the health of his noble descendant and worthy representative."
This example was followed by all the gentlemen present. The harp struck up a triumphal strain, and the old squire already mentioned vociferating the first stave, they sang, or rather roared, the following chorus.
Hail to the headlong, headlong, headlong. All hail to the headlong, headlong, headlong. The headlong, headlong, breakneck, headlong, cataract, pistol, rider, headlong. The bright bow we steep in the name of headlong. Let the youth pledge deep to the headlong, headlong, and the rosy glasses touch the brim as it passes, and kiss the red tide for the headlong, headlong. The loud harp resounds in the hall of the headlong, the light step rebounds in the hall of the headlong. Where shall music invite us, or beauty delight us, if not in the hall of the headlong, headlong? Huzzah to the health of the headlong, headlong. Fill the bowl, fill the floods to the health of the headlong, till the stream ruby glowing on all sides overflowing shall fall in cascades to the health of the headlong. The headlong, headlong, at breakneck, at headlong, at cataract, at pistol, at rider, at headlong.
Squire Headlong returned thanks with an appropriate libation, and the company re-adjourned to the ballroom, where they kept it up till sunrise, when the little butler summoned them to breakfast. End of chapter 13.